then the only way to account for what he wrote in that report, the only possible conclusion is he wrote what he wrote because it was true. And for Israel, that was a complete catastrophe, a disaster for them, and to this day it's proven very difficult for them to undermine the credibility of his report. Because for the first time, really, Israel has been forced to confront the facts. They can't they can't character assassinate the messenger, and so now they're forced to look at the message. And it's very difficult to undermine the content of that message. The second significant aspect of the Goldstone report is that Goldstone himself is a kind of quintessential Jew. He's a liberal in his sensibilities. He's a lawyer by profession. He believes, as he says, in international law, international institutions. And so he's kind of your typical Jewish supporter of Israel, because Jews themselves are overwhelmingly liberal in their political inclinations. And you saw it very clearly in the results of the last election. It was 78% of Jews voted for Barack Obama. From the electorate as a whole, it was 53%. So Jews were 25 points greater than the electorate as a whole. Among whites, the white electorate, it was 43% for Obama. And so Jews were 35 points higher than whites in general. Among Hispanics, it was 67% for Obama. So Jews were 11 points higher than Hispanics. And if you factor in socioeconomic status, then the Jewish vote is totally, so to speak, out of whack, with which one would expect. The only group, religious or ethnic, the only group that voted in greater numbers for Barack Obama were African Americans, where it was about 95%. Jews are overwhelmingly liberal. There's many kinds of evidence. I just read yesterday this horrific book by Norman Podhoretz, Why Are Jews Liberal? When you read Norman Podhoretz, the real question is, why is this man writing books? He's a complete imbecile. But he goes through all the data. He laments the data, of course, but the data is overwhelming on every single issue. Jews are to the very far extreme of the liberal spectrum. And that's an important fact, because liberalism, not only, but in large and significant part, it means belief in international institutions, belief in the rule of law, belief in human rights and human rights organizations. And it's now become completely untenable for somebody to call themselves liberal and to defend Israeli policy. And things took, to some extent, there was a quantitative or qualitative change in what happened in Gaza, because all of Israel's previous encounters with Arabs, they were always a mixture of military attack and attack on civilians. But they always had a military component. They were never the only component. In all the wars, Israel targeted significantly targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. But it was never only civilians and civilian infrastructure. Gaza was the first of Israel's encounters with its neighbors where it was just a massacre. There was no military component to it. And for that reason, it was a kind of turning point. It's simply impossible any longer to defend Israeli policy and to call yourself a liberal. If you follow the actual coverage, there were only a handful of people who came out swinging in Israel's defense. That fellow from Harvard and a couple of others. But it was also very striking after what happened in Gaza, that when the Goldstone report came out, even though no major newspaper came out supporting Goldstone against Israel, it's also a fact that no newspaper came out supporting Israel against Goldstone. There wasn't a single editorial in any major newspaper in the U.S. which supported Israel against Goldstone. Many chose not to comment, but none would defend Israel against Goldstone for the same reason, that it's impossible any longer to reconcile liberal sensibilities with defense of Israeli policy. And the third major outcome of the Goldstone report, it's hard to say how long it's going to last, but for the first time in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, in a long time, the human rights issue has moved center stage, and it's at least now on a par with the so-called peace process, and even temporarily, I don't think it's going to last, but temporarily it displaced the peace process, the human rights issue, displaced the peace process as the main focus of the conflict. And that was a very important development because that's where Israel is weakest. And if you look at the history, just to briefly go through it, on the history of the human rights issues, take, for example, the question of torture. If you open up now Israeli books, histories by Israelis, you take, for example, Benny Morris's book, Righteous Victims, or Tom Segev's book on the 1967 war, they both say that they acknowledge Israel routinely tortured Palestinian detainees from right after June 1967. But for those of you in this room who go back a ways, you will remember that well into the 1980s, no human rights organization, let alone the media, would acknowledge Israel's use of torture. It was simply unsayable. I'm not sure if it was unthinkable, but it was unsayable. And that includes Amnesty International. Amnesty was very careful never to use the word torture when it came to Israel. In the 1980s, Amnesty had declared the 1980s the decade to end torture, and it put out a famous book. It was called Torture in the 80s. And when it came to Israel, they would not use the word torture. And the reasons were fairly obvious, and they go back to the point I made earlier, which is Jews are liberal, and Jews happen to be very wealthy. And you combine the two, and what you get is many of the human rights organizations are financed by liberal Jews. And the organizations were very careful and worried about the plug being pulled on them if they were too hard on Israel. Now things started to change with the first Intifada, and they changed basically for two reasons. Number one, the torture of Palestinian detainees became epidemic. All of the human rights organizations subsequently wrote that Israel's torture of Palestinian detainees